The plane was parked at the gate, bathed in the bright afternoon sun. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and smelled faintly of expensive leather and citrus. Passengers were slowly finding their seats, stowing their carry-on bags in the overhead compartments, and settling in for the long flight ahead. It was a full flight, but the first-class section was quiet, a separate world of wide seats and legroom. Near the front of the cabin, an actor who is known all over the world for his humble nature and his action movies was trying his best to be invisible. He was dressed simply, wearing a dark jacket, a t-shirt, and a pair of well-worn jeans. He didn't have an entourage or bodyguards with him. He was just another passenger, hoping to get some rest before he landed. He kept his head down, his dark hair messy but neat, and avoided making direct eye contact with anyone as he shuffled into his window seat. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from working long hours, and he just wanted to disappear into the background. Most people on the plane were busy with their own lives, checking their phones or adjusting their pillows. But one man in the row across the aisle had very sharp eyes. This man was dressed in a suit that looked like it cost more than most people's cars. He had his tie loosened and was speaking loudly into his phone, demanding that someone on the other end fix a problem immediately. He was the kind of person who wanted everyone to know how important he was. As he ended his call and looked around the cabin, his gaze landed on the actor in the window seat. A smirk spread across the businessman's face. He recognized the face immediately. It was the star of the movie about the bus that couldn't slow down, the guy who fought agents in the Matrix, and the one who played the assassin with a puppy instead of being excited or respectful. The businessman saw an opportunity to be the center of attention. He nudged the woman sitting next to him, tapping his arm aggressively. "Hey, look over there," he whispered, though his whisper was loud enough for several rows to hear. "That is Keanu Reeves. Can you believe it? I thought he'd be flying on a private jet or something. Maybe his movies aren't doing as well as they say." The woman looked over, offered a polite smile, and turned back to her magazine. Clearly not interested in causing a scene, but the man in the suit wasn't done. He felt entitled to poke fun at the celebrity. He cleared his throat loudly and leaned back in his seat, making sure his voice carried. "You know, they say fame is fleeting," he said, talking to no one in particular but looking directly at the back of the actor's head. "Some guys peak in the 90s and just have to ride that wave forever. Must be hard to sit in first class on a regular airline when you used to be a big shot." A few passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They exchanged glances, wondering if the man was going to stop or if he was going to keep going. The actor, hearing the comments, didn't turn around immediately. He stayed focused on the screen in front of him, scrolling through what looked like emails or a script. He had dealt with this kind of thing before. People often felt like they owned a piece of him because they had seen his face on a screen so many times. But the man in the suit was getting more confident. He wasn't getting a reaction, and that annoyed him. He wanted the actor to acknowledge him. He wanted a story to tell his friends at the club later. "Maybe I should ask for an autograph," the man laughed, nudging his neighbor again, though she looked annoyed now. "Do you think he signs them for free these days, or do I have to buy him a drink first?" He laughed at his own joke, a harsh, barking sound that cut through the low hum of the airplane. The tension in the cabin was getting thicker. The flight attendants, busy preparing for departure, noticed the disturbance but hesitated to intervene, hoping the man would calm down once the plane took off. The man in the suit, however, decided to escalate things. He unbuckled his seatbelt even though the seatbelt sign was still on. He leaned over the empty seat next to him, invading the personal space of the row in front of him. "Hey, Neo," he called out, using the name of the actor's most famous character. "How's the Matrix treating you these days? Need a blue pill or a red pill to wake up from this flight?" It was a mean-spirited joke, designed to mock rather than amuse. At that moment, the actor slowly turned around. His face wasn't angry. He didn't look offended. He just looked calm and polite, which seemed to confuse the bully even more. He looked the man in the suit in the eyes, waiting for him to say something else, but the businessman just kept smirking, waiting for a fight. The actor offered a gentle nod, a silent acknowledgement of the man's presence. and then turned back to his window. Watching the ground crew below finish loading the luggage, the lack of anger seemed to frustrate the man. He sat back in his seat, crossing his arms over his chest. He wanted to humiliate the actor, to make him feel small, but the actor's calm demeanor made the businessman look petty instead. The other passengers, who had been watching with annoyance, now looked at the businessman with judgment. He had tried to mock a movie star for being just a person, but in doing so, he had shown everyone else on the plane exactly what kind of person he was. As the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their departure, the cabin fell quiet again, but the air was still charged with the awkwardness of the confrontation. The actor kept his eyes on the window, ready for the plane to take off, while the man across the aisle fumed silently, his ego bruised by a man who simply refused to play his game. The plane had lifted off the ground, leaving the city behind as it climbed higher into the bright blue sky. The engines roared steadily, a comforting sound that usually helped passengers relax, but the air in the first-class cabin was still far from calm. The man in the expensive suit was sitting rigidly in his seat, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He was staring at the back of the actor's head with a look of pure annoyance. He couldn't understand it. He had made a loud, obvious joke. He had mocked a famous person. Why wasn't there a reaction? Why wasn't the actor angry? Why wasn't he trying to defend himself? The silence from the window seat was bothering the rude man more than any insult could have. He tapped his fingers impatiently on the armrest, the rhythm fast and jagged. The woman sitting next to him, who had politely ignored his earlier comments, was now trying to bury her nose in a magazine, hoping he would just settle down and sleep. But he wasn't interested in sleeping. He felt a strange need to prove that he was better than the movie star sitting a few feet away. He leaned closer to his seatmate, keeping his voice loud enough to carry over the hum of the engines. "Can you believe the attitude?" he whispered harshly, nodding his head toward the window. "He thinks he's too good to talk to anyone. That's the problem with these Hollywood types. They get a little bit of money and they forget where they came from. They think they are gods." The woman didn't look up. She just turned the page of her magazine, clearly wishing she could switch seats. The man huffed, annoyed that she wasn't joining in. He looked around the cabin, trying to catch someone's eye, but most people were putting on headphones or closing their eyes. The flight attendant came by with the drink cart, offering beverages to the passengers. The man in the suit ordered a scotch, neat. When he got it, he swirled the amber liquid in the glass, taking a sip and letting the alcohol burn his throat. He felt a buzz of courage, or maybe it was just his ego getting larger. He watched the flight attendant move to the next row and offer a drink to the actor. The actor asked for a water. "Just a simple water." "No fancy drink? No special treatment?" The man in the suit scoffed loudly. "Water," he mimicked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Of course. Just a regular guy, right? I bet he's just waiting for the paparazzi to show up at the airport." He laughed again, a dry, humorless sound. He was still trying to get a rise out of the person in the window seat. He wanted the actor to turn around and say something, anything. He wanted to be the guy who stood up to the celebrity. But the actor just took the water bottle with a polite nod to the flight attendant and took a small sip. This was too much for the businessman. The lack of reaction felt like an insult to him personally. He unbuckled his seatbelt. The seatbelt sign was still illuminated, the small "no smoking" symbol glowing above him, but he didn't care. He felt like he owned the space. He leaned over, pushing his body out of his seat and invading the empty space between the rows. He was now directly behind the actor, looming over him like a dark cloud. The passengers around them noticed. A teenage girl in the row across looked up from her phone, her eyes wide with concern. An older man a few rows ahead lowered his newspaper, watching the scene unfold with a frown. The tension in the cabin, which had been slowly fading, suddenly snapped back, tighter than before. Everyone knew that something bad was about to happen. The air felt heavy, like the pressure inside the plane was dropping, but really, it was just the social pressure of a stranger crossing the line. The man in the suit reached out. His hand moved slowly, deliberately. He didn't tap lightly. He poked the actor hard on the shoulder. It wasn't a friendly gesture. It was aggressive, a physical demand for attention. The actor paused, his hand holding the water bottle midair. He lowered the bottle slowly. He didn't flinch, but he took a deep breath, perhaps preparing himself for what was coming. He turned his head slightly, looking out of the corner of his eye first, then turning fully in his seat to face the man leaning over him. The actor's face was calm, but his eyes were serious. He didn't look scared. He just looked like a man who was being bothered and wanted to know why. He raised his eyebrows slightly, a silent question. "Yes?" the actor asked softly. His voice was low, barely audible over the engine noise. The businessman straightened his back, puffing out his chest. He felt all eyes were on him, and he loved it. He thought he was the star of the show now. He sneered, looking down at the actor with a mixture of pity and disgust. He wanted to hurt the actor with his words, to cut him down to size in front of everyone. "Hey, aren't you that guy?" The businessman started, his voice loud and slurred slightly from the drink. "Aren't you that guy from the bus movies? You know, the one where the bus can't stop? What was it called, Speed?" He didn't wait for an answer. He laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Yeah, that's it. I didn't know they paid you enough to sit up front here. I figured with your career you'd be in the back with the rest of the has-beens." The cabin went deadly silent. The only sound was the constant hum of the engines. You could hear a pin drop. The teenage girl covered her mouth with her hand, shocked by the rudeness. The older man with the newspaper shook his head slowly, looking at the businessman with disgust. The flight attendant, who was standing at the front of the cabin securing the galley, froze. She looked toward the seats, her hand hovering over the call button, wondering if she should call the captain or intervene, but the actor didn't look angry. He didn't shout. He didn't stand up and yell at the man to sit down. He just sat there, looking at the businessman. There was a sadness in his eyes, a kind of tired look that said he had seen this kind of ugliness before. He looked at the man in the suit, really looked at him, as if trying to figure out what would make a person act this way. The actor's silence made the businessman even more uncomfortable. He had expected a fight. He had expected the actor to get defensive or maybe yell at him to leave him alone. Instead, the actor just waited, letting the silence hang in the air like a heavy weight. The businessman felt the need to fill the silence. He wasn't done. "I mean, come on," he continued, pointing a finger at the actor's chest. "What have you done lately?" "Nothing. You're washed up. We're all stuck on this plane with a guy who used to be famous. It's embarrassing, really. You should be thanking us for even buying tickets to your old movies." He laughed again, glancing around the cabin, looking for validation. But nobody was laughing. The other passengers were looking at him with cold stares. They didn't see a funny guy making a joke. They saw a bully picking on someone who was just trying to have a quiet trip. The man in the suit started to sweat a little. The alcohol was making his face red and the collar of his shirt felt tight. He realized he wasn't getting the applause he wanted. He was just making a fool of himself, but his ego wouldn't let him stop. He leaned in closer, invading the actor's personal space even more. "Well, what do you have to say for yourself? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just stupid in real life, like the characters you play?" It was a shocking thing to say to a stranger, especially on a plane where everyone is trapped together. The rudeness was breathtaking. The woman sitting next to the rude man finally couldn't take it anymore. She sighed loudly, picked up her bag, and flagged down a flight attendant, asking if she could move seats. She wanted nothing to do with him. The businessman watched her leave, surprised that she was leaving him. He looked back at the actor, his face twisting into a scowl. He was angry now. He was angry that the actor wouldn't fight back, and he was angry that the other passengers were judging him. He was a fly that couldn't understand why he couldn't land on the wall. The actor looked at the empty seat where the woman had been sitting, then back at the man. He took a slow breath. He could have said a million things. He could have insulted the man's suit, his manners, or his obvious insecurity. He could have used his status to put the man in his place. But he didn't. He just sat there, a portrait of dignity amidst the chaos of the confrontation. He looked at the businessman with a gaze that was calm but steady, waiting for the storm to pass. The plane hit a small pocket of turbulence, shaking the seats, but the actor didn't blink. He just held his ground, showing everyone watching that true class isn't about how much money you have or where you sit on a plane, but how you treat people when they are treating you badly. The silence in the cabin stretched out, thick and heavy, like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. The businessman's chest was heaving slightly from his outburst. His face was flushed a deep red, clashing horribly with the crisp white collar of his expensive shirt. He was leaning forward, his fingers still pointing, waiting for the explosion. He wanted the actor to yell. He wanted him to stand up and make a scene. In his mind, that was how famous people behaved. They had big egos and short tempers. He was ready for a fight. He was ready to pull out his phone and record it, maybe sell the video to a tabloid or show it off to his friends to prove that he had stood up to a Hollywood star. But the explosion never came. The actor didn't shout. He didn't even frown. Instead, his face softened. The lines around his eyes, which had been tense a moment ago, relaxed. It was a transformation that happened slowly, right in front of everyone. He looked at the angry man, not with hatred or judgment, but with a strange kind of pity. It was the look someone gives a child who is throwing a tantrum because they dropped their ice cream. It was a look that said, "Asterisk, I see you are hurting. And I am sorry for you." Asterisk, the actor slowly turned his body all the way around in his seat, undoing his seatbelt so he could face the man properly. He rested his hands on his knees, palms open. It was a completely non-threatening posture. The businessman paused, his finger wavering in midair. The actor's calmness was like a bucket of cold water thrown on a fire. It was confusing. It didn't make sense. The man in the suit didn't know how to react to someone who refused to be his enemy. "Yeah, that's me," the actor said. His voice was soft, barely louder than the hum of the air conditioning. There was no sarcasm in his tone. He wasn't being smart. He was just agreeing with the truth. "I'm the guy from the movies." The businessman opened his mouth to say something else, to throw another insult, but the words got stuck in his throat. The actor's gaze was steady and kind. It disarmed him completely. It's hard to hate someone who looks at you like they actually care about what you have to say, even when what you are saying is mean. The actor nodded his head once, a small, polite gesture. "I hope you enjoy the flight," he added gently. Then, just like that, the actor turned back to his window. He didn't wait for a reply. He didn't wait for an apology or a high five. He simply ended the conversation. He reached down to his tablet, tapped the screen to wake it up, and went back to reading his script. It was as if the most aggressive verbal attack he had just faced was nothing more than a fly buzzing around his head. He had swatted it away without killing it, without getting angry, and without letting it ruin his day. The businessman froze for a second, his mouth still slightly open. He looked like a statue of confusion. He pulled his hand back slowly, lowering his finger. The adrenaline that had been pumping through his veins suddenly turned cold, leaving him feeling shaky and awkward. He looked around the cabin, expecting people to be laughing at him, but no one was. In fact, the mood had shifted completely. The teenage girl across the aisle wasn't covering her mouth in shock anymore. She was looking at the actor with a soft smile, admiration written all over her face. The older man with the newspaper had gone back to reading, but he was shaking his head with a look of respect. Even the flight attendant, who had been watching closely, relaxed her shoulders and went back to arranging the napkins. The danger was over. The storm had passed, not with a bang, but with a whisper. The man in the suit sat back in his seat, but he couldn't get comfortable. He felt small. He had tried to make himself look big by carrying someone else down, but it had backfired completely. By reacting with kindness, the actor had made the businessman look like the only child in the room. It was a powerful lesson in humility, though the businessman was too proud to learn it just yet. He grabbed his glass of scotch and gulped the rest of it down, the ice clinking against his teeth. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes darting around nervously. He grumbled under his breath, loud enough for himself to hear, but not loud enough for anyone else. "No personality," he muttered, trying to convince himself that he was still the winner. "Guy is a robot, boring." He crossed his arms tightly across his chest and stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the back of the actor's head again. He felt cheated. He had wanted a story about how he told off a movie star, But now he just felt like a bully who had picked on the nicest guy in the world. For the next hour, the plane flew through smooth, blue skies. The sun was high outside, casting long shadows across the interior of the cabin. Most of the passengers settled into a routine. Some put on headphones to watch movies. Others leaned their seats back to catch a nap. The low roar of the engines became a soothing white noise that filled the space. The actor remained in his seat, calm and focused. He took notes on his tablet occasionally, pausing to think, chewing on the end of his pen slightly. He looked like any other passenger working on a project, except for the fact that he treated the flight attendants with immense respect every time they walked by. When one offered him a refill on his water, he smiled warmly and thanked her by name, even though he had only met her an hour ago. He treated her like a human being, not just someone there to serve him. It was a small thing, but in the enclosed world of an airplane, small things matter. Meanwhile, the man in the suit stewed in his seat. The alcohol was making him sleepy, but his pride kept him awake. He kept shifting his weight, trying to find a position that didn't feel so humiliating. He noticed that people were avoiding looking at him. The woman who had moved seats earlier was now laughing quietly with someone a few rows back, and he felt sure they were talking about him. Paranoia started to creep in. He checked his phone, scrolling through emails aggressively, tapping the screen harder than necessary. He wanted to prove he was busy, that he was important, that he was a big deal. At one point, the actor got up to use the restroom. He had to squeeze past the man in the suit because the aisle was narrow. The businessman stiffened as the actor approached. He didn't know if he should say something or look away or stare him down. He tensed his muscles, preparing for a confrontation. But the actor didn't even look at him. He stood up carefully, stepping into the aisle. As he passed the businessman's seat, he lightly touched the man's shoulder to steady himself. "Excuse me," the actor whispered politely. As he squeezed by, the businessman flinched at the touch but didn't say a word. He just stared straight ahead at the seat back in front of him, his jaw clenched tight. As soon as the actor was out of earshot, heading toward the front of the plane, the businessman let out a long, shaky breath. He realized he had been holding his breath the whole time. It was exhausting being angry. It was exhausting trying to hate someone who refused to hate you back. While the actor was in the bathroom, the flight attendant stopped by the businessman's row to pick up his empty glass. She looked at him, her expression neutral but professional. Usually she would chat a bit with the first-class passengers, asking if they needed anything else. But this time she just took the glass. She didn't smile. She didn't ask if he was enjoying the flight. She had seen everything that had happened earlier. She had heard the cruel words and seen the actor's kind response. Her silence was louder than any verbal reprimand. It made the man feel even smaller. When the actor returned, he squeezed past the row again. "Sorry," he said softly, giving a small nod as he sat back down. He immediately picked up his tablet and went back to work. As if the interruption had never happened, the businessman looked at the actor's profile. He saw the gray hairs at the temples, the lines of concentration on his forehead. He saw a man who was probably 50 years old, just trying to live his life. The businessman suddenly felt a pang of guilt, sharp and uncomfortable. He tried to push it away, telling himself that the actor was rich and famous and didn't care what he thought. But he knew that wasn't true. The actor had cared enough to be polite. He had cared enough not to fight back. The atmosphere in the cabin had completely changed. The tension that the businessman had created was gone, dissolved by the actor's simple decency. The air felt lighter. People were relaxed. The businessman, however, felt like he was carrying a heavy weight on his shoulders. He looked out the window, watching the clouds pass by, feeling isolated and alone. He was surrounded by people, yet he had never felt more separate from them. He had tried to bring the actor down to his level, but instead he had pushed himself further away from everyone else. He sat in his expensive suit, in his expensive seat, feeling poorer than he ever had in his life. And as the flight continued, the silence between the two rows grew, not from anger, but from a quiet understanding of who was really in control of the situation. The flight had been smooth for the last 2 hours. a gentle ride through the sky that allowed most people to drift into a sleepy rhythm. The drone of the engines had become a comforting background noise, lulling passengers into a false sense of security. The actor had kept his head down, still focused on his work, occasionally taking a sip of water. The businessman in the suit had finally stopped fidgeting and seemed to be dozing, his head resting against the wall, his mouth slightly open. The tension from the earlier argument had faded into a dull, awkward silence that everyone was trying to ignore, but the sky above them was changing. Unseen to the passengers, the plane was flying towards a weather front, a massive bank of storm clouds that brewed dark and angry on the horizon. Inside the cabin, the air pressure began to shift. Some passengers felt a pop in their ears. The flight attendants, sensing the change in the air, began to move through the aisles, collecting cups and checking seatbelts. They were professionals, and they knew that calm weather could turn chaotic in a matter of seconds. Suddenly, the fasten seatbelt sign chimed overhead. It was a loud, distinct ding that cut through the quiet cabin. Immediately following the sound, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Folks, we're hitting some rough air ahead. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, please take your jump seats." Almost before the captain finished speaking, the plane dropped. It wasn't a gentle dip. It was a violent, stomach-churning plunge that felt like the floor had fallen out from under them. Drinks sloshed out of cups. The plane rattled and shook, the metal frame groaning under the stress. A collective gasp went through the cabin, followed by a few sharp cries of alarm. The man in the suit jerked awake, his eyes flying open. He grabbed the armrests with both hands, his knuckles turning white instantly. The color drained from his face, replacing the red flush of anger with a pale, sickly green. "What is happening?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Can't this guy fly a plane?" He looked around wildly, his eyes wide with panic. The tough guy act, the arrogance, the bullying, it all vanished the moment he felt he wasn't in control. He was just a scared man in an expensive suit, terrified of the turbulence. A few rows ahead, the situation was much worse. There was a young mother traveling alone with an infant. The baby had been sleeping peacefully in her arms, but the sudden drop woke him up with a start. He didn't just wake up. He began to scream. It was a high-pitched, piercing wail that cut through the noise of the engines and the wind. The mother looked exhausted. She tried to bounce the baby, shushing him gently, but the plane shook again. A violent side-to-side jolt that threw her against the window. The panic in her eyes was visible. She was trying to stay calm for her child, but she was clearly frightened. In her haste to comfort the baby, she tried to reach for her bag on the floor to get a pacifier or a bottle. As she leaned over, the plane hit another air pocket and her bag tipped over. Contents spilled everywhere. A bottle of formula rolled under the seat in front of her. A bag of diapers opened up, sending white diapers sliding across the floor. And a small container of baby food popped open, splattering mushy orange food onto the carpet. It was a disaster. The mother looked down at the mess, then at her screaming baby, and tears welled up in her eyes. She felt overwhelmed. She was trapped in a shaking metal tube, miles above the ground, with a crying child and a mess she couldn't clean up. She looked toward the galley for help, but the flight attendants were strapped into their jump seats by the doors. They were looking backward, concerned expressions on their faces, but safety regulations meant they couldn't get up and move around the cabin. They were helpless, just like the passengers. The man in the suit saw the commotion. He heard the baby screaming. He saw the spilled food and the diapers rolling toward his row. Did he help? Did he offer a kind word or a hand? No, he pulled his feet up, tucking them under his seat, terrified that a dirty diaper might touch his expensive leather shoes. He squeezed his eyes shut and muttered, "Great, just great. This is exactly what I needed." Babies crying and garbage everywhere. He was angry. He felt that the mother was being annoying, that the pilot was incompetent, and that the world was conspiring to ruin his flight. He sat there, rigid with fear and selfishness, judging everyone else while doing absolutely nothing to help. Then a seatbelt clicked open. It came from the row across the aisle. The actor unbuckled his belt. He ignored the shaking of the plane. He ignored the fasten seatbelt sign glowing above his head. He didn't look worried. He looked determined. He stood up, his legs steady despite the tremors running through the floor of the aircraft. He had to crouch slightly to keep his balance as the plane bumped and swayed. He moved into the aisle and walked steadily toward the young mother. The passengers nearby watched in amazement. Most people were gripping their armrests, praying for the turbulence to end. Here was a man, a famous actor who could have stayed in his seat and waited for it to pass, deliberately walking into the chaos. When he reached the mother's row, he didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't announce himself. He just knelt down on the floor. It wasn't a comfortable place to be. The floor was vibrating and the legroom was tight. He didn't care about his knees or his jeans. He reached out and picked up the rolling bottle of formula. He set it on the seat. Then he began gathering the scattered diapers, scooping them up with calm, practiced hands. The mother looked down, startled. She saw the familiar face, the tousled dark hair, and the gentle eyes looking up at her from the floor. She blinked through her tears, shocked. I'm so sorry, she stammered, her voice shaking. It's such a mess. I can't. It's okay, the actor said. His voice was low and steady, a grounding force in the middle of the storm. Don't worry about it. I've got it. He reached further under the seat to retrieve a pacifier that had slid out of reach. As the plane gave another violent lurch, he held onto the seat back to steady himself so he wouldn't fall into her. Once he had collected the loose items, he looked at the baby, who was still screaming at the top of his lungs. The mother looked defeated, trying to rock the baby but shaking herself from nerves. The actor didn't ask permission. He just saw a need and met it. He held out his hands, palms up, looking at the mother. A silent question. Asterisk, can I help? Asterisk, the mother, desperate and exhausted, nodded. She gently passed the sobbing infant to him. The actor took the baby carefully, supporting his head with one hand and his bottom with the other. He didn't hold the baby like a prop or an accessory. He held him with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He stood up slightly, finding his balance against the seats, and began to sway. Not fighting the movement of the plane, but moving with it. He bounced the baby gently, up and down, a rhythmic motion that was soothing and hypnotic. He looked into the baby's face, his expression soft and full of focus. He made soft, shushing sounds, quiet whispers that only the baby could hear. It's all right, he murmured. We're almost there. You're doing great. The contrast in the cabin was stark. On one side of the aisle, you had the wealthy businessman, eyes squeezed shut, gripping his armrests, cursing the turbulence and resenting the noise. He was paralyzed by his own fear and ego. On the other side, you had the world-famous movie star, kneeling on the dirty floor of a moving airplane, holding a stranger's crying baby. Completely unconcerned with his own comfort or image, the turbulence began to ease. The violent shaking turned into a gentle bump, and then just a steady vibration. The baby, feeling the calmness of the person holding him, stopped screaming. He let out a few hiccuping sobs and then settled down, resting his head against the actor's chest, fascinated by the dark jacket. The mother let out a long breath, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She watched the actor rocking her son, a look of immense relief and gratitude washing over her face. The other passengers were watching too. The teenage girl had her phone out, but she wasn't recording. She was just watching, smiling. The older man with the newspaper had folded it away completely. There was a warmth in the cabin now, a feeling of shared humanity that had nothing to do with money or status. The actor, still holding the sleeping baby, looked over at the mother and smiled. It wasn't a movie star smile. It was just a smile from one person to another, acknowledging that flying is hard, parenting is hard, and sometimes we all need a little help. He had taken a moment of chaos and turned it into a moment of peace, simply by being kind enough to stand up. The plane finally leveled out, leaving the violent bumps and the gray storm clouds far behind them. The roar of the engines settled back into a steady, rhythmic hum that felt like a sigh of relief. Inside the cabin, the air slowly began to change. The sharp smell of fear and coffee was replaced by a feeling of calm. People unbuckled their seatbelts, though many kept their hands near the latches just in case. But the most noticeable change was the silence. It wasn't the empty silence of before, but a peaceful one. In the row across the aisle, the actor was still standing. He had shifted his weight so he wouldn't block the aisle, but he remained close to the mother. The baby was now completely asleep, his small cheek resting against the actor's dark jacket. The actor held the child with one arm securely around his back, his other hand resting gently on the baby's head. He wasn't in a rush to give the baby back. He swayed slightly, moving with the motion of the plane, looking down at the sleeping infant with a softness that made everyone who watched him melt a little inside. The young mother was wiping her face with a tissue. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the kind you take after you've been holding your breath for too long. She looked at the actor holding her son, and her eyes were full of tears, but they weren't tears of stress anymore. They were tears of gratitude. She couldn't believe that a stranger, let alone a world-famous movie star, had knelt on the floor to help her. He didn't do it for the cameras. There were no cameras rolling. He didn't do it for attention. He did it simply because he saw she was struggling. The actor sensed that she was calmer now. He looked up at her and gave her a small, reassuring smile. He leaned forward slowly, carefully transferring the sleeping baby back into her arms. The transition was smooth, professional even. The baby didn't stir. He just nestled back into his mother's chest, feeling safe and warm. "Thank you," the mother whispered. Her voice was so quiet it was almost lost in the drone of the engines. "I don't know what I would have done. You didn't have to do that." The actor shook his head slightly, dismissing the praise. He reached out and gently squeezed the mother's shoulder. It was a fatherly gesture, warm and comforting. "You're doing a great job," he said softly. "He's beautiful. Don't worry about the mess. It happens." He didn't say anything about being famous. He didn't introduce himself or act like he had done something special. To him, it just seemed like the natural thing to do. He glanced down at the floor, where he had gathered the spilled diapers and the bottle. He handed the few remaining items to her with a nod, then straightened up. He stretched his back slightly, his joints popping from the uncomfortable position he had been in, and then he turned to walk back to his own seat. As he moved down the aisle, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The passengers he passed didn't look away or pretend not to see him this time. They looked him in the eye. The teenage girl smiled at him, her face glowing. The older man with the newspaper gave him a respectful nod of acknowledgement. Even the flight attendant, who was back on her feet organizing the galley, stopped what she was doing to mouth the words, "Thank you," to him. It was a clear moment of collective respect. The cabin had witnessed something real, and they were honoring it, but not everyone was happy. In the seat across from the actor, the man in the expensive suit was shrinking smaller and smaller. He had watched the entire scene from his seat. He had seen the actor kneel down. He had seen the calmness in the actor's eyes. He had seen the way the baby had stopped crying. And he had seen how the other passengers were looking at the actor now with admiration. The man in the suit felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. It started at his collar and burned his ears. He pulled his tie loose, feeling like it was choking him. Just an hour ago, he had been the loud one, the powerful one. He had mocked the actor, calling him a washed-up has-been. He had tried to prove that he was better than a celebrity. But now, the truth was staring him right in the face, and it was painful. The actor wasn't a has-been. He was a man of character. And the man in the suit? He realized he was just a bully with a nice watch. When the plane was shaking and people were scared, the actor had stood up to help, while the businessman had sat frozen in fear, worried only about his shoes and his comfort. The contrast was undeniable. The actor had class, real, honest class that doesn't depend on money or fame. The businessman had nothing but an expensive suit and a loud voice. When the actor walked past his row to get back to his window seat, he didn't look at the businessman. He didn't glare at him. He didn't say, "See? I'm not a loser." He just kept walking, stepping over the man's outstretched legs with the same polite care he would use for anyone. That indifference hurt more than any insult could have. It showed the businessman that he simply didn't matter. The actor had moved on from the insults completely. He was in a different place, a higher place, and the businessman was left behind in the mud of his own anger. The rest of the flight passed quietly. The sun began to set outside the windows, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The actor spent the time looking out the window, reflecting on the horizon. He seemed at peace. The mother fell asleep with her baby, exhausted but resting easy now. The businessman, however, couldn't relax. He fiddled with his phone, deleting emails without reading them. He avoided eye contact with everyone. He felt like there was a spotlight on him, but not the kind he wanted. He felt the judgment of the cabin pressing down on him. He knew that if he opened his mouth now, no one would want to hear it. Eventually, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the initial descent into their destination. The flight attendants began the final safety check, making sure seatbelts were fastened and tray tables were stored. The mood in the cabin was sleepy but content. Everyone was ready to be home. As the plane taxied to the gate, the usual scramble began. The ding of the seatbelt sign turning off triggered people to stand up and grab their bags from the overhead compartments. It was a rush of noise and movement. The actor stood up slowly, waiting for the line to move. He didn't push his way forward. He stood patiently in the aisle. The businessman unbuckled his belt. He wanted to get off the plane as fast as possible. He wanted to escape the heavy feeling of embarrassment that was sitting on his chest. He grabbed his briefcase, not even looking around. He was the first one out of his row, hurrying toward the exit. But as he passed the mother, he paused for a split second. She was looking up, trying to get her bag down. The businessman could have helped her. It would have been a small gesture, a way to redeem himself. But he didn't. He felt too ashamed. He just kept walking, his head down, avoiding her eyes. The actor, however, stepped in. He reached up and effortlessly pulled the heavy bag from the bin for the mother. He smiled at her one last time and whispered, "Have a safe trip." She beamed back at him, her gratitude shining in her eyes. It was a small moment, but it showed exactly who these two men were. As the passengers filed out of the plane, something interesting happened. Usually when a celebrity is on a flight, people whisper and point as they deplane. They might try to sneak a selfie or ask for an autograph in the jet bridge. But today was different. No one crowded the actor. No one held up their phones. They just smiled at him as they walked by, some giving him a thumbs up, others just nodding. They gave him the gift of normalcy, respecting his privacy while acknowledging his kindness. They were treating him like a hero, but a quiet one. The businessman was walking far ahead. He didn't look back. He was focused on the terminal doors, just wanting to get away. He had wanted to be the center of attention, and he was, but not in the way he expected. The story of the flight wasn't going to be about the rich guy who told off a movie star. It was going to be about the movie star who held a crying baby while the rich guy did nothing. The actor walked out of the jet bridge and into the airport terminal. He put his backpack over his shoulder and headed toward baggage claim, blending into the crowd. He didn't have an entourage. He didn't have a security team pushing people aside. He was just a traveler, walking with a gentle stride. Looking a little tired, but happy. Behind him, the passengers from the flight spread out into the airport, but they carried the story with them. They would tell their friends and families about it later that night. They would say, "You won't believe what happened on my flight. There was this rude guy mocking Keanu Reeves, and then something amazing happened." They would talk about the kindness, the humility, and the shock of seeing true character in action and the businessman. He got into a taxi and drove away. He probably never told anyone about the flight. He probably deleted the angry texts he wanted to send about the rude celebrity. He went back to his world of suits and deals, but something had changed. For the rest of his life, every time he saw one of the actor's movies on a poster, or saw his face on a screen, he would remember that day on the plane. He would remember the turbulence, the crying baby, and the feeling of sitting in his expensive seat while a better man knelt on the floor. And he would know, deep down, that money can buy a first-class ticket, but it can't buy the respect of others. That has to be earned, one small act of kindness at a time. The actor had won without fighting a single battle, simply by being a good human being.